Benicia sits at the edge of the Carquinez Strait, where the Sacramento River narrows before it opens toward the bay. Vallejo is a few miles north and east, a city that grew around a naval station and spread into quiet residential streets that ran up low hills above the water. Lake Berryessa lies farther inland, a long reservoir pressed between the ridgelines of Napa County, its shoreline popular with picnickers and fishermen in the warmer months. San Francisco is south, an hour or so by car depending on traffic and the crossing, its streets and neighborhoods separated from all three of those other places by water and by county lines that existed for administrative reasons, and that in the late summer of 1969 would come to matter in ways that no one in any of those jurisdictions had anticipated. These four places are the confirmed geography of a specific criminal record. They are points on a map of Northern California that share no single police jurisdiction, no unified command, no coordinated investigative authority that covered all of them at once. What they shared and what connects them in the documented record is that letters began arriving at newspaper offices across the Bay Area in the summer of 1969, and those letters referred to events that had taken place across exactly those four locations, in Benicia and Vallejo, and at the lake, and in the city. And whoever had written those letters knew that the distance between the jurisdictions was real, and that the coordination required to respond to them would be slow and complicated and imperfect. The confirmed attacks that formed the foundation of the case occurred between December of 1968 and October of 1969. The record places them in those four separate locations, each one falling under a different county or city investigative authority, each one generating its own reports and its own evidence and its own departmental chain of command. The Solano County Sheriff's Office held jurisdiction over events in Benicia and Vallejo. Napa County held jurisdiction over events at the lake. The San Francisco Police Department held jurisdiction over the city. None of those agencies reported to the same command, and the sharing of case information between them in that period depended on telephone calls and postal mail and the individual decisions of investigators who recognized that the cases might be connected and who acted on that recognition through informal channels rather than through any established structure built for exactly this purpose. On or around July 31st, 1969, 3 envelopes entered the postal system somewhere in the Bay Area. Each one was addressed to a different newspaper. One was addressed to the San Francisco Examiner. One was addressed to the San Francisco Chronicle. One was addressed to the Vallejo Times-Herald. All 3 letters were mailed on or around the same day, a coordination that once the letters arrived and their contents were compared was immediately apparent to the editors and reporters who handled them. Each letter contained the same thing, a portion of a cryptogram. The cryptogram was composed of symbols, not letters of the standard alphabet, but a set of characters drawn from multiple sources, arranged in rows and columns on the page in a dense block of printed marks. Taken alone, each of the 3 portions was incomplete. No single letter contained enough of the cryptogram to attempt a solution. The message had been divided into thirds before it was sent, distributed across 3 separate envelopes addressed to 3 separate publications, so that the full cryptogram only existed in assembled form, only visible to someone who had all 3 portions and placed them side by side and read across them as a single document. The total symbol count of the assembled cryptogram came to 408 characters. Investigators and researchers who examined the 3-part construction noted that the division was deliberate. The sender had planned the layout of the cipher before writing it out, had calculated how to divide it across 3 pieces, and had addressed 3 separate envelopes to 3 separate institutions, all apparently on the same day. This was not an impulsive act. The logistics of mailing 3 near-simultaneous letters to 3 different newsrooms, each one containing a portion of the same encoded message, required a prior plan and a specific intention. The editorial offices that received those letters in late July and early August of 1969 were staffed by journalists who initially could not be certain whether the letters were authentic communications from the person responsible for the confirmed attacks, or whether they were fabrications from someone seeking attention. The cipher portions themselves were not immediately interpretable. The symbols on the page were not standard text that could be read directly. They required assembly first, and then they required a method for decoding, and neither of those things happened on the day the letters arrived. What editors and reporters at all 3 publications confirmed, once the portions were compared and assembled, was that the full 408-symbol grid was a single coherent cryptogram, that the 3 pieces fit together into one document, and that the document appeared to be an encoded message of some kind. The question of what it said, and who had written it, and whether the claim embedded in the letters was genuine, remained open in those first days, in a way that would not stay open for long. The second letter that entered the documented record came on August 7th, 1969. It was mailed to the San Francisco Examiner, and it opened with a phrase that would be repeated, quoted, referenced, and analyzed for the following decades. The phrase was, "Dear Editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." The name Zodiac appeared in the record for the first time in that letter. It was not a name that law enforcement had assigned. It was not a name taken from mythology or astrology by investigators working to identify the sender. It was a name the writer gave to himself, in his own handwriting, at the top of a letter addressed to a newspaper in San Francisco on the 7th of August in 1969. The block printing of the confirmed Zodiac letters is one of the first things that investigators and researchers comment on when describing the physical documents. The letters are not written in cursive. They are not written in a flowing, personal hand that varies from line to line in the way that most people's everyday writing does. The characters are formed individually, each one printed rather than joined to the next, the result resembling the deliberate hand of someone who has decided in advance exactly how each letter will look on the page. Handwriting analysts who examined the confirmed letters noted that block printing of this kind is significantly more resistant to comparative analysis than cursive writing, because the individual character forms are more controlled, and because the natural variation that makes cursive handwriting distinctive is largely suppressed. The choice of block printing rather than cursive is in the documented record, treated as a deliberate decision made before the first letter was written, a feature of the correspondence that was maintained consistently across years of communication. The name the writer chose for himself had no prior existence in the case record. No investigator had proposed it. No press coverage had used it. It arrived fully formed in the August 7th letter, presented without explanation, appended to an opening line that assumed its own authority. This is the Zodiac speaking. The name was self-selected and self-applied, and from that date forward, it became the designation by which the investigation and the press and the public would refer to the writer of those letters and to the person responsible for the confirmed attacks in those 4 separate locations across Northern California. The confirmed attacks had taken place across a span of roughly 10 months between December of 1968 and October of 1969. The documentary record places the first confirmed events in Benicia, in Solano County, in the very last days of 1968. Subsequent confirmed events are placed in Vallejo and at Lake Berryessa in the following year. The final confirmed attack in that sequence is placed in San Francisco in October of 1969. Each of those events generated a separate investigative record under a separate jurisdiction, and the question of how those records were shared and coordinated across county lines was one that the investigators involved had to resolve without any pre-existing framework designed specifically for that kind of multi-jurisdictional case. The map of those 4 locations, Benicia, Vallejo, Lake Berryessa, San Francisco, is not the map of a single city or a single county or a single investigative territory. It is a map that spans the northern edge of the Bay Area and reaches inland, that crosses the Carquinez Strait and the Napa County line and the boundary of San Francisco proper. The distances between those points are not vast by the measure of a car on a California highway, but in terms of police jurisdiction, they might as well have been separate countries, each one requiring its own warrants, its own command authorizations, its own chain of evidence and reporting. The letters that arrived at the newspaper offices in August 1969 were addressed to publications that circulated across all of those jurisdictions, a press audience drawn from the full geographic range of the Bay Area. And the writer had chosen those 3 specific newspapers, the Examiner, the Chronicle, the Times-Herald, with apparent awareness of where each one circulated and who its readers were. The letter that carried the name Zodiac for the first time also carried a demand. The writer instructed the newspapers to publish the cipher on their front pages and indicated that if this was not done, he would proceed with further violence. The instructions were specific, and the framing was clear. The writer expected the newspapers to act on his communication, and expected the public to see it, and expected the cryptogram to be printed in a form that a wide audience could examine. The 3-part division of the cipher across 3 different newspapers had already ensured that no single publication held the complete message, and now the demand for front-page publication specified the form in which the assembled cryptogram should appear. This was not a private communication sent to investigators. It was a public transmission addressed to a press audience. The editors of the newspapers consulted with law enforcement before deciding how to respond. The San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald each made decisions about publication under the conditions that applied in August of 1969. The assembled cipher was published. It appeared in print, and once it appeared in print, it was available to anyone who purchased or read the newspaper, to investigators, to the press, to the general public, and to anyone with an interest in cryptography who might attempt to decode it. The Z408, the name by which the assembled cryptogram would come to be known, was in print in the Bay Area newspapers within days of the letter's arrival. The next phase of the documented record concerned not the letters themselves, but what the cipher said, and who would be the first to determine that. The opening lines of that August 7th letter, with the name Zodiac printed at the top and the block characters running down the page, established the register in which all subsequent confirmed correspondence would be written. The writer addressed editors personally, used first-person constructions throughout, made claims about confirmed events that investigators took seriously as potential authentication, and maintained across every subsequent letter the same block-printed, controlled, deliberate handwriting that had characterized the first communication. The name, the printing style, the first-person address, the crossed circle symbol that appeared near the signature line in confirmed letters, all of these elements were consistent from August 1969 onward. Across a correspondence that investigators have documented at approximately 20 letters spanning 5 years, the crossed circle symbol requires a brief description because it recurs throughout the confirmed correspondence in a consistent form. It is a circle divided by two perpendicular lines, forming a cross, the cross extending to the edges of the circle, drawn in ballpoint ink in most of the confirmed letters. The symbol appeared as a kind of signature mark, present in confirmed letters from the earliest communications onward. In some letters, it appeared near the writer's self-designation as Zodiac. In some, it appeared as a visual ornament alongside other content, but its presence across the confirmed letters, drawn in a consistent form, became one of the features investigators used to distinguish confirmed communications from the larger volume of correspondence that arrived at newspapers and police departments from other senders during the active period of the case. The volume of letters that arrived at San Francisco area newspapers and law enforcement agencies in the wake of the first confirmed Zodiac communications was substantial. When a case of this kind receives wide press coverage, the correspondence generated by it includes authentic communications from the person responsible, and it also includes letters from others, from people who wish to insert themselves into the case, from people experiencing their own crises who find the coverage resonant, from people attempting to deceive investigators or journalists. The process of distinguishing confirmed Zodiac correspondence from non-Zodiac correspondence in the case record was an investigative task that continued for years, and it was carried out using factors that included the handwriting, the symbol, the inclusion of authenticated physical evidence in some letters, and the presence of case-specific information that the writer of confirmed letters demonstrably knew. The authentication of confirmed letters in the case record is a careful and specific thing. Some letters were confirmed through handwriting comparison against the established examples. Some were confirmed through the inclusion of pieces of physical evidence, items taken from crime scenes that the writer could not have possessed without direct involvement in the documented events. Some were confirmed through the correspondence of case-specific details that had not been made public and that the writer demonstrated knowledge of. The confirmed letter count of approximately 20, documented across 5 years from 1969 to 1974, represents the result of that authentication process. Letters judged by investigators to be genuine communications from the person responsible for the confirmed attacks. The first letter carrying the name Zodiac, mailed on August 7, 1969, was one of a cluster of communications sent in that first period. The 3-part cipher letters of late July had established the correspondence. The August 7th letter had introduced the self-chosen name. Subsequent letters in that early period continued the communication, adding claims about events, adding demands, adding postscripts in the same block printing that updated the letter count, or added further commentary on news coverage. The stated motive that appeared in the decoded cipher, decoded by a married couple in Salinas, within a week or so of the cryptogram's newspaper publication, the decoded text confirmed by investigators is part of the documented record of the case. The writer stated in the decoded text that killing provided what he described as the most thrilling experience he knew. The writer stated that he was collecting slaves for an afterlife, and that his victims would serve him after death. These were the writer's own words, encoded in the cipher, decoded from it, and confirmed as the content of the message he had mailed to 3 newspapers in late July of 1969. They are part of the case record in the same way that the block printing and the crossed circle symbol and the confirmed letter count are part of the case record as documented facts held in the investigative files, examined and re-examined over the years. The motive, as stated, was not one that investigators could corroborate through external evidence. It was a claim made in a cipher by the person who had also made the cipher, and its significance in the record is not that investigators confirmed it as literally true, but that it was the writer's own account of his own intentions, stated in the only direct communication he left behind in decoded form. The cipher said what the writer intended it to say, at least in part. The decoded portion of the Z408 accounted for 390 of its 408 symbols, and the remaining 18 symbols at the end of the decrypted grid did not resolve to legible English text, and that portion of the message remained unread, a short cluster of characters at the end of an otherwise solved cryptogram. The summer of 1969, in the months after the letters arrived, was a period of investigative activity across multiple Bay Area agencies. The confirmed attacks had drawn the attention of county sheriff's offices and the San Francisco Police Department, and had generated a press response that brought the case to a very wide public. The letters had added a dimension to the case that was new. The person responsible was not only carrying out attacks, but was communicating about them actively in writing through the press. The choice to write to newspapers rather than to investigators directly was itself a documented feature of the correspondence. The letters went to editors and journalists, to the public institutions of the press, rather than to the police departments, investigating the events described. The reasons for this choice were never stated directly in the confirmed letters. The record documents the choice, but does not document a stated explanation for it. What the record does document is the effect. The letters generated coverage that the writer could follow, and the confirmed letters show evidence of active monitoring of that coverage, with the writer in later communications referencing specific news articles and responding to press descriptions of the investigation in ways that indicated he was reading the newspapers and tracking how the case was being reported. The Zodiac's correspondence, viewed across its full confirmed span, represents a sustained written engagement with the press, and through the press with the public, that lasted from August 1969 to January 1974. The bulk of the confirmed letters arrived between August 1969 and the end of 1971, a period of roughly 2 years in which the correspondence was most active and in which the case received its widest and most sustained press coverage. After 1971, the confirmed letter frequency declined. The last accepted letter in the confirmed correspondence was postmarked January 29, 1974, nearly 5 years after the 3-part cipher had entered the postal system on or around July 31, 1969. What the full documented correspondence shows, across those 5 years and approximately 20 confirmed letters, is a sustained and deliberate written record. It is not the record of a single impulsive communication. It is not the record of a brief campaign that ended quickly. It is the record of a sustained engagement, maintained over years, in which the writer continued to write to newspapers and occasionally to individuals, continued to use the same block printing and the same crossed circle symbol, continued to claim responsibility and to add details and to reference press coverage of himself, through a period that extended far past the cluster of confirmed attacks that the correspondence referred to. The geography that the correspondence referred back to, those 4 points on the Northern California map, the water town at the strait, the city across the bay, the inland lake, the naval station city on the hills, remained the fixed reference point of the case, even as the letters continued. The events had occurred across those 4 locations, across those 4 separate jurisdictions. The letters arrived at newspapers and offices across the Bay Area, addressed in block printing, carrying the crossed circle symbol, signed with the self-chosen name. The investigation that followed the letters ran across the same multi-jurisdictional territory as the events themselves, coordinated through informal channels and shared information rather than through any unified command. 5 years of confirmed correspondence, approximately 20 letters, a case that was opened across multiple jurisdictions in 1968 and 1969, and that has not been formally closed by any of the agencies that hold portions of the record. The San Francisco Police Department's case file, like the relevant county sheriff's files, remains officially open. The documents in those files include the confirmed letters, the cipher texts, the decoded and undecoded portions of the cryptograms, the investigative reports generated across years of active work, and the results of subsequent reviews conducted as forensic methods advanced. The confirmed correspondence is the most complete portion of the record in one sense. The letters are physical documents. They can be examined, their content is known, where it has been decoded, and their existence across 5 years is not a matter of investigative inference, but of documented fact. The confirmed attacks that the correspondence referred to are also documented, but the investigation that ran between those two sets of documented facts, the inquiry into who had carried out the attacks and who had written the letters and who had encoded the ciphers and mailed them to 3 newspapers on or around a single day in July 1969, that investigation, conducted across multiple agencies and across multiple decades, produced no formal conclusion that could be entered into a case file as a closing determination. The letters are there, the cipher is there, in its decoded and undecoded portions. The crossed circle symbol is there, present on confirmed communications from August 1969 through January 1974. The name Zodiac is there, self-chosen, introduced on August 7th, 1969, in the opening line of a letter addressed to the San Francisco Examiner and carried forward across every subsequent confirmed communication. The file is open. The record persists. It is the nature of a record like this one that it accumulates over time without necessarily arriving at the form of conclusion that opens and closes a case in the clean administrative way that investigative systems are designed to produce. The confirmed attacks occurred across a span of months. The confirmed correspondence continued for 5 years. The investigative record, the documents generated by the agencies that held jurisdiction, the analyses conducted by investigators and cryptographers and forensic specialists, the reviews triggered by advances in technology, or the emergence of new leads accumulated over decades without resolving into the single determination that would close the file. What the record contains at the end of the time it covers is exactly what it has always contained: the specific places and the specific dates and the confirmed letters with their block printed characters and their crossed circle symbols, the 3 envelopes mailed on or around a single July day to 3 separate newspapers in the Bay Area, the self-chosen name introduced in August and maintained for 5 years, and the approximately 20 confirmed communications that make up the written record of a correspondence that began in 1969 and formally concluded by the last accepted postmark in January of 1974. The case has been open since 1968. The letters that entered the correspondence record in 1969 are still held in evidence storage. The cipher texts, those that were solved and those that were not, are still documented in the case files. The crossed circle symbol is still present on the last confirmed letter as it was on the first. The investigation that was opened across those 4 jurisdictions, Benicia, Vallejo, Lake Berryessa, San Francisco. The 4 points on the Northern California map that the record connects has not been formally closed by the agencies that hold it. That is the span of the confirmed written record. 5 years of correspondence, approximately 20 letters, a beginning in the summer of 1969, when 3 envelopes moved through the postal system on the same day, and a last confirmed communication in January of 1974. What came between those 2 dates, and what the record produced, and what the record still contains and still does not contain, is the substance of the documented history that the case files hold. The files remain open, the letters remain in storage. The questions the case generated remain the questions they always were, held in the long persistence of a record that has not been closed. A confirmed Zodiac letter, when investigators first handled it, did not look like the work of someone writing quickly or carelessly. The block-printed characters sat evenly on the page, each one formed with a consistent pressure, each line running parallel to the one above it in a way that suggested the writer had taken time. There was no cursive. There was no looping connection between letters, no ligature, no flowing stroke that might have given a handwriting analyst something to hold on to. The characters were printed one at a time, each one self-contained, each one placed with the same deliberate attention as the one before it. Investigators examining the letters in the context of the case noted this quality immediately. The absence of cursive was understood from early in the correspondence as a practical choice, one that reduced the diagnostic value of the handwriting itself. A forensic document examiner working from a sample of block printing has less material to work from than one working from a flowing habitual cursive hand. The individual letter forms are more standardized, the personal habits of a writer's grip or rhythm less legible in them. What the block printing produced across letter after letter was a document that looked controlled and prepared rather than dashed off in a moment of feeling. The plain paper added to this quality. The letters were not written on personal stationery, not on paper with a watermark or a letterhead that might have been traced to a supplier or a region. The paper was the kind available everywhere, carrying no particular identity, offering investigators nothing in the way of sourcing. The envelopes were similarly unremarkable. The stamps were placed with care. What arrived at the newspaper offices was a document designed at every level of its physical construction to be a communication without an origin. The San Francisco Chronicle was among the most frequent recipients of the Zodiac's correspondence. The letters arrived in the ordinary mail, processed through the mailroom alongside the day's other incoming post, and by the autumn of 1969, the staff at the Chronicle had developed a familiarity with what to look for. The crossed circle symbol that the Zodiac used as a kind of signature or return mark was by then a recognized shape. An envelope bearing it, or a letter opened to reveal it, was handled differently from ordinary mail, set aside, passed up the chain, eventually placed into the chain of custody that connected the newspaper offices to the active investigation. The routine of receiving the letters, documented in accounts from the period, carried its own particular quality. The letters came irregularly. There was no schedule the newspaper staff or investigators could anticipate. A letter might arrive after weeks of silence or follow quickly after a previous communication. Each one required the same response, handling with care, documentation of its arrival and condition, notification of investigators. The letters were simultaneously objects of evidence and objects of publicity, since the Zodiac's correspondence was from the beginning directed as much at the press as at any investigative agency. The postscripts were a recurring feature of the correspondence that investigators and researchers have noted as a consistent stylistic habit. In several confirmed letters, the main text concluded, "The writer's thoughts apparently complete," and then a postscript followed, marked PS, in the same block printing, set apart from the body of the letter as a separate edition. These postscripts were not afterthoughts in any casual sense of the word. They contained substantive content, updated claims about the number of the Zodiac's victims, references to news coverage the writer had seen, additional taunts or demands directed at law enforcement or the newspapers. The presence of postscripts across multiple letters indicated, to investigators reviewing the correspondence as a whole, that the writer was attentive to his own communications as structured documents. The postscript form implies a body of text that was completed and then reopened. Whether the postscripts were truly added after the main letter was written or were planned from the beginning and formatted as postscripts by design, the case record does not establish. What the record does establish is that the habit was consistent and that the content of the postscripts was always substantive rather than incidental. The kill count updates were particularly noted as a feature of the postscripts and of several letter bodies. The Zodiac's stated count of victims climbed across the correspondence, eventually reaching the claim of 37 victims. Investigators treating this figure against the confirmed and formally attributed cases found a significant and documented gap. The number of murders directly attributed to the Zodiac, based on evidence, witness accounts, and the killer's own authenticated communications, was a fraction of 37. Researchers and law enforcement analysts working the case have consistently treated the inflated count as a part of the Zodiac's documented effort to project a presence larger than what the confirmed record supported. The claim of 37 victims was never substantiated by corroborating evidence. Investigators did not find unsolved cases that could be credibly linked to the confirmed Zodiac pattern in numbers sufficient to approach that figure. The gap between the claim and the confirmed record is itself part of the documented history of the correspondence, a feature of the letters that is noted, recorded, and held at its proper weight, which is to say, the weight of an unverified assertion rather than an established fact. The November 1969 letter that described a bomb placed along a school bus route is among the more precisely documented pieces of the Zodiac's correspondence in terms of its technical content. The letter included specific descriptions of how the device had been rigged, a level of mechanical detail that prompted investigators to take the threat seriously enough to conduct searches. No device was found. The case record documents the threat and documents the outcome, a search that produced no physical evidence of any bomb or components consistent with the described construction. Investigators at the time could not confirm whether the bomb description reflected genuine technical knowledge or was constructed from available sources. The letter gave enough specificity to require a response, and the response produced nothing. The threat itself as a feature of the letter has been noted by researchers as consistent with the broader pattern of the correspondence, a communication that made claims requiring action, claims that could not be fully dismissed, but claims that ultimately rested on the Zodiac's word alone. The same letter that described the bomb extended the Zodiac's reach beyond the specific geography of his confirmed crimes. Where the earlier correspondence had been most directly connected to the Bay Area newspapers and the immediate aftermath of the documented attacks, the November 1969 letter gestured toward a wider potential action, one affecting a route, a population, children on their way to school. Investigators noted this expansion of scope. The threat was taken seriously, and then, after the searches produced nothing, added to the file as a documented element of the correspondence, that remained unverified. The letters in aggregate, read in the order they were confirmed to have arrived, show a writer who was following his own press coverage with consistent attention. References to news reporting appeared across the correspondence. The Zodiac noted when articles had been published, when his cipher had been mentioned, when coverage of his correspondence had appeared. The postscripts containing these references documented a relationship between the writer and the newspapers that was not simply one of a sender to a passive recipient. The Zodiac was reading what was being written about him and writing back. This quality of attentiveness to coverage has been treated by investigators and researchers as a confirmed feature of the case rather than a matter of interpretation. The references in the letters were specific enough to establish that the writer had access to Bay Area news coverage, had read it, and was responding to it. The correspondence was a two-way exchange in this sense, not a conversation, since the newspapers and investigators could not reply in kind, but a monitored one, with one party watching the other's published response and adjusting his own communications accordingly. The Melvin Belly letter of December 20th, 1969, stands as the piece of the correspondence that has attracted the most sustained documentation and discussion for the specificity of its departure from the register of the other letters. Melvin Belly was a prominent San Francisco defense attorney, nationally known, whose name would have been familiar to anyone following Bay Area legal news in the 1960s. The Zodiac's decision to address him by his first name, Dear Melvin, rather than addressing the letter to an editor or to law enforcement, was, in the context of the confirmed correspondence, a notable variation. The Belly letter opened with that personal address and proceeded in a register that investigators and researchers have documented as tonally distinct from the majority of the Zodiac's confirmed communications, where most of the letters carried what might be described as a triumphant or taunting quality. Updates on victim counts, declarations about collecting slaves for the afterlife, dares to investigators to catch him. The Belly letter included the phrase bad spells, and the writer described himself as experiencing bad spells, a phrasing that stood in contrast to the confident declarations of the other correspondents. Investigators documented the Belly letter in the context of the full correspondence and noted the tonal difference without arriving at a definitive interpretation of it. Whether the shift in register represented a genuine change in the writer's state, a strategic performance of distress, or some other dimension of the communication, the case record does not confirm. What the record confirms is the text itself, the personal address, the description of bad spells, the distinct quality of the letter against the body of other confirmed communications. The enclosed material authenticated the letter in a specific and documented way. Within the envelope was a small piece of fabric, a swatch cut from Paul Stein's blood-stained shirt. Paul Stein was the San Francisco cab driver whose murder on October 11, 1969, was directly attributed to the Zodiac, and pieces of his shirt had been cut from the garment at the scene. The Zodiac had referenced the shirt in earlier correspondence and had enclosed pieces of it in previous letters as evidence of his responsibility for the crime. The swatch in the Belly letter was documented as consistent with the physical evidence from the Stein case, providing material authentication of the letter's origin. The combination of elements in the Belly letter, the personal address, the tonal shift, the authenticated physical enclosure, made it one of the most examined documents in the confirmed correspondence. The choice of recipient was itself a subject of investigative attention. Belly was a defense attorney, not a prosecutor, not a police official. He was a figure associated in the public imagination of the period with high-profile legal representation and visible advocacy. The Zodiac's decision to write to him personally, using his first name, has been noted by investigators and researchers and has not been fully explained by any confirmed documentary evidence. Belly received the letter at his San Francisco office. The letter was passed to investigators, documented, and entered into the evidence record. Belly himself gave interviews in the period following his receipt of the letter, noting the unusual quality of the communication. His responses to those interviews are part of the public record of the case from 1969 and 1970. The letter is part of the confirmed correspondence, its text established, its enclosure documented, its place in the sequence of the Zodiac's communications fixed in the case record. The block printing on the Belly letter matched, to investigators' examination, the block printing of the other confirmed Zodiac correspondence. The symbol used as a signature, the crossed circle, a circle divided by a cross, appeared on the letter as it did on others. These features of consistency place the letter within the confirmed body of correspondence, even as its content and address differed from the majority of the other letters. The letters from late 1969 and into 1970 represent the most active period of the confirmed Zodiac correspondence. Multiple letters arrived across these months, each one adding to the documented record that investigators were accumulating. The bomb threat, the kill count updates, the reference to news coverage, the Belly letter with its authenticated enclosure, these communications arrived within a span of weeks, building a correspondence record that was denser in this period than at any other time in the confirmed sequence. After 1970, the correspondence became less frequent. Letters still arrived, confirmed against the established features of the Zodiac's communications, the block printing, the crossed circle symbol, the specific stylistic habits that had been documented across the earlier letters, but they came at longer intervals. The last confirmed communication in the accepted case record was mailed in 1974. In the years between, the letters continued to accumulate the same specific quality that the first ones had carried, carefully printed on plain paper, deliberate in their construction, addressed to newspapers or to specific individuals, each one bearing the crossed circle mark that had appeared on the first letters in August 1969. The habit of monitoring press coverage persisted into the later letters. The Zodiac's references to specific articles and specific coverage dated across the correspondence, and the later letters continued to show this attentiveness. The relationship between the correspondence and the newspaper coverage of it was one of the more precisely documented features of the Zodiac case. A writer who sent letters to newspapers read those newspapers for coverage of his own letters, and then sent further letters that referenced the coverage they had received. The kill count claims across the correspondence shifted over time, with the figure moving upward in increments. Researchers examining the sequence have documented these shifts and placed them against the confirmed case record. The gap between the claimed count and the confirmed count grew as the claimed number increased. Investigators did not revise their assessment of the confirmed cases based on the claimed numbers. The inflated figures remained part of the documented record of the correspondence as unverified assertions, consistent across the letters in their pattern of exceeding what the evidence could support. The school bus threat occupied a specific position in the sequence of the correspondence, arriving in November 1969 at a point when the case had received significant press attention and when investigators were actively working the confirmed crimes. The specificity of the threat, the detail about the rigging of the device, the reference to the particular population that a school bus route would carry, all of these were documented elements of the letter. The searches that followed the threat were documented. The absence of any device was documented. The letter and its outcome became part of the case record as it stood at the end of 1969, a threat made, a threat investigated, a threat that produced no physical evidence beyond the letter itself. The progression of the correspondence through late 1969 into 1970 was marked by this pattern of claims that demanded responses that produced nothing, and further communications that updated or extended the claims. Investigators working within this pattern documented it as it developed. The correspondence created its own investigative record, not just the letters themselves, but the actions they prompted, the searches, the examinations, the notifications, all of it documented in the files that the case accumulated across these months. The Belly letter, arriving on December 20th, 1969, came toward the end of this particularly active period. Investigators receiving it had already processed a significant body of correspondence. The authenticated enclosure, the piece of Paul Stein's shirt, connected the letter directly to the confirmed physical evidence of the Stein murder. That physical connection gave the letter a specific weight in the case record that distinguished it from communications that rested only on the writer's assertions. The swatch was not a claim. It was a piece of documented physical evidence whose presence in the envelope could be confirmed against the case record of the Stein investigation. The phrasing about bad spells has been returned to by researchers over the decades since the letter's receipt. It appeared in a single confirmed letter addressed to a single specific individual in a context that differed from every other confirmed communication in the Zodiac's correspondence. What it meant, what it described, what relationship it bore to the other communications that surrounded it in the sequence, these are questions the case record does not answer. The text of the letter establishes what was written. What the letter represents beyond that text is a matter the documented record leaves open. Melvin Belly died in 1996. The letters he received, the interviews he gave in 1969 and 1970, his place in the documented history of the Zodiac correspondence, these remain part of the case record. The letter addressed to him is part of the confirmed correspondence, its text established, its enclosure documented, its unusual quality noted by investigators and researchers across the decades since its arrival. It sits within the body of the Zodiac's confirmed communications as the letter that addressed a specific named person by his first name, described something called bad spells, enclosed a piece of authenticated physical evidence, and has never, in the case record that has accumulated since December 1969, been fully explained. The confirmed correspondence as a whole represents a documented record built across 5 years, from the first letters in August 1969 to the last confirmed communication in 1974. The individual letters within that record carry different qualities, some triumphant in their claimed counts, some taunting in their dares to investigators, some technical in their descriptions of threats, and at least one different from all the others in its address and its register. What they share is the consistent physical appearance, block printing on plain paper, the crossed circle symbol, the stylistic habits that investigators documented early and confirmed across every subsequent communication. The mailrooms of the Bay Area newspapers received these letters over the course of 5 years and routed them, one by one, into the investigative process. Each letter was handled, photographed, examined, entered into evidence, compared against the letters that had come before. By the time the last confirmed letter arrived in 1974, the case had accumulated a body of documentary evidence that was, in its own right, a substantial archive. The original letters, the envelopes, the enclosed physical materials, the investigative notes and responses, and findings that each communication had prompted. What the correspondence records, in its totality, is a 5-year written campaign that was deliberate in its construction, attentive to its own reception, and consistent in its physical presentation across a span of time that outlasted the confirmed murders. The letters are what they have always been since they first arrived. Documented communications in an open case, each one examined and preserved, each one part of a record that investigators have carried without a formal conclusion across more than half a century. The Belly Letter of December 20th, 1969, within this record, holds its specific and documented place. Its unusual address, its description of bad spells, the swatch of Paul Stein's shirt folded inside the envelope, these details are confirmed. Their interpretation is not. The letter exists in the case file exactly as it arrived, its content established, its meaning carried forward as a documented open question in the same way that the correspondence as a whole has been carried, carefully, without resolution, across all the years since it was first placed in the mail on a December day in San Francisco in 1969. The gap between what the Belly Letter states and what it can be confirmed to mean is a gap that the case record has held since the moment investigators first opened the envelope. Researchers have returned to it across the decades. The text has not changed. The enclosure has been documented and preserved. The questions that the letter raises about why this specific recipient, this specific first name address, this specific description of bad spells appearing in a body of correspondence that otherwise carried no such register, these are questions that investigators have noted, examined, and ultimately placed in the file alongside everything else the correspondence contains. The file is still there. The letters are still in it, including the one addressed to Melvin, dated December 1969, different from the others in ways that have been documented and noted and returned to across decades of examination, and still carrying, in the precise text of its block-printed lines, the same open question it has always carried, a question the case record acknowledges, holds carefully, and has not yet answered. The Z408 was built from 54 distinct characters. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Not the 26 letters of a standard alphabet, not a simple one-for-one substitution that a careful reader might work through by hand on a quiet afternoon, but 54 separate symbols drawn from multiple existing systems and from the cipher's maker's own invention, assembled into a grid that held 408 characters in total, and that required all 3 of its published sections to be present before it could be read as a complete thing. The characters in that set included standard capital letters of the English alphabet, letters written in reverse or rotated from their usual orientation, symbols borrowed from the Greek alphabet, marks taken from astrological notation, and a further set of glyphs that did not correspond to any existing system, but had been drawn specifically for this cipher and found nowhere else in the record of documented writing. It was a constructed alphabet assembled from pieces of several real ones, and its method of operation was specifically designed to defeat the most straightforward tool available to anyone who might try to read it. That tool was frequency analysis. In any language, certain letters appear more often than others. In English, the letter E appears with greater frequency than any other character, followed by T, then A, then O, in a distribution that is consistent enough across texts of sufficient length to be statistically predictable. A cipher that substituted one symbol for each letter of the alphabet, always the same symbol for each letter, would eventually reveal its structure through this frequency pattern, because the most common symbol in the cipher text would correspond to the most common letter in the plain text, and from that starting point a skilled analyst could work forward through the rest. The method used in the Z408 was designed to prevent that. It was a homophonic substitution cipher, meaning that common English letters were assigned not one symbol, but several, multiple different symbols that all decoded to the same letter, available for use interchangeably at the cipher maker's discretion, so that the frequency distribution of symbols in the ciphertext did not mirror the frequency distribution of letters in the underlying English. The symbol appearing most often in the cipher was not necessarily the symbol for E, because E had been distributed across several different symbols, each used some of the time, none of them dominant. The frequency was deliberately flattened, the statistical pattern deliberately obscured. The Z408 grid itself appeared across 3 separate newspaper pages in late July and early August of 1969. The San Francisco Chronicle received 1 portion. The San Francisco Examiner received a second. The Vallejo Times-Herald received a third. Each section was a partial block of the 408-character grid, complete enough to be recognized as a cipher, incomplete enough to be unreadable without the other 2 parts. All 3 newspapers published their sections within the same period, and only when a reader gathered all 3 and laid them beside one another did the full grid exist as a single, uninterrupted sequence of 408 symbols, arranged in rows, dense and regular on the page. The symbols pressed onto the paper in the same block printing style present in the accompanying letters. For anyone looking at those combined pages in the first days of August 1969, the cipher sat there as a documented object, a grid of unfamiliar characters, some recognizable as letters, some as astrological marks, some as shapes that had no apparent origin in any existing system. The newspapers had printed it at the insistence of the writer, who had stated in his accompanying letters that the cipher contained his identity and who had demanded its publication under a threat he had articulated in writing. The editors of each newspaper made their own decisions about how to respond to that demand, and the cipher was published. Once published, it was available to anyone who bought a newspaper, which meant it was available to Donald and Betty Hardin, who lived in Salinas, California, and who, over the course of approximately 1 week in August 1969, worked through it at their kitchen table and produced a solution. Donald Hardin was a high school teacher. His subjects were history and economics. The record does not describe him as a trained cryptanalyst or as a professional with formal experience in code breaking. What the record shows is that he and his wife obtained copies of the published cipher sections, assembled them into the complete 408-character grid, and applied systematic reasoning to its contents. Betty Hardin contributed the critical initial insight. Her reasoning was grounded in what she understood about the cipher's likely content before any character had been identified. The accompanying letters had made clear that the cipher's writer was describing himself and his acts and his stated motivations. Given that, the text was almost certain to contain the word I, with some frequency, appearing at or near the beginnings of sentences, in positions where a first-person writer, making declarative statements, would naturally use that word. It was also, she considered, highly probable that the word kill appeared somewhere in a text written by someone who had explicitly described killing people in the letters that accompanied the cipher. These were guessed fragments of plaintext, what cryptographers call cribs, words assumed to be present somewhere in the decoded text, whose known or probable character sequences could be tested against the symbol distribution of the ciphertext. The testing process was methodical. A crib word of known length placed into a probable position in the ciphertext generates a set of symbol-to-letter assignments. If the word kill appears at a given position, then the symbol at that position maps to K, the next to I, the following to L, and the one after that to L again. Those proposed assignments can then be checked against other positions in the ciphertext where those same symbols appear. If the proposed mapping is correct, the other positions should produce additional readable English text, and if it is incorrect, they should produce incoherence. The Hardens worked forward from these initial assumptions, testing proposed assignments, finding consistent results, discarding inconsistent ones, building an expanding map of symbol-to-letter correspondences. The homophonic nature of the cipher meant that a single letter could be represented by multiple different symbols, so each new symbol encountered required a fresh assignment decision, rather than a lookup against an already determined alphabet. The process required attention and patience and a willingness to hold several partial hypotheses in mind at once, testing them as new symbols confirmed or contradicted each proposed assignment. Over approximately 1 week at their kitchen table in Salinas, the grid that had appeared across 3 newspaper pages became readable text. The Hardens submitted their solution to the San Francisco Chronicle, the solution reaching the newspaper's offices by August 8, 1969, less than 2 weeks after the first cipher sections had been published. The solved cipher was subsequently reviewed by law enforcement and by independent analysts, and the Harden solution was confirmed as accurate. The plaintext that the Z408 decoded to was written in English in the same block-printed style as the accompanying letters, with the same irregular spelling that appeared across the Zodiac's known correspondence. The text opened with a declaration of motive, the writer stating directly that he enjoyed killing people because it was entertaining to him, describing it as more engaging than hunting animals in the open country, and offering as his reason for this preference the claim that people were the most dangerous quarry. The specific words, with their misspellings intact as decoded, read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all to kill." The word forest was spelled with 2 R's. The word dangerous was spelled without the second G. These were not decoding errors introduced by the Hardens. They were present in the ciphertext itself, encoded by the cipher's maker, and transmitted through the cipher into the decoded output. The text continued. The writer elaborated on what killing provided for him, a specific kind of experience he described as thrilling, one he compared favorably against other activities. Then the text turned to a statement of belief about what happened after death. The writer described his victims as slaves who would serve him in an afterlife. He stated that the more slaves he collected in this life, the more he would have available to him after it. This was the passage that the letter accompanying the cipher had briefly referenced, and which the published cipher, now solved, confirmed in its full form. The writer used the word paradise, his spelling, to describe where he expected to go and where his collected slaves would accompany him. The same misspelling appeared across multiple confirmed Zodiac communications, consistent enough across letters to be treated by investigators as a marker of authentic origin. The Z408 plaintext ran for 390 characters of decoded English before it stopped producing legible text. The final 18 symbols of the grid did not resolve to readable language under the confirmed solution. The Hardens had worked through the complete 408-character grid, and the substitution cipher that their crib-based approach had identified produced coherent English for 390 characters. At character 391, the sequence ceased to decode to anything recognizable. The final 18 symbols sat at the end of an otherwise solved cipher as a short, unresolved block. Their meaning, if any, undetermined. Investigators and researchers who reviewed the solved cipher in the period immediately following the hardened solution noted the undecoded block and considered several possibilities. One held that the final 18 characters encoded the cipher maker's name, that the statement in the accompanying letter claiming the cipher contained a means to identify the writer extended not to the full 408-character grid, but specifically to that terminal block, a name appended after the main text but using a different encoding method, or a different key that the rest of the solution did not cover. Another possibility, which the confirmed solution itself did not settle, was that the final 18 symbols were not meaningful encoded text at all, that they had been placed at the end of the cipher specifically to suggest the presence of a hidden name, while actually encoding nothing, a constructed dead end, positioned to frustrate anyone who solved the main body of the cipher and expected to find an identity waiting at its conclusion. A third possibility was simpler, that the final 18 characters were padding, filler characters, placed to bring the total symbol count to a number that fit the grid dimensions the cipher maker had chosen for the published layout, without encoding any additional content. What the record shows is that the final 18 characters have remained unresolved since August 1969. The hardened solution was confirmed. The 390-character decoded text was authenticated, and the 18-symbol terminal block remained exactly as it appeared in the original grid, present, documented, and without a confirmed reading. Investigators who worked the case in 1969 were unable to produce a confirmed solution for those characters. Researchers and cryptographic analysts who reviewed the cipher in subsequent decades were similarly unable to confirm a reading. The block is not encrypted under the same substitution key as the rest of the cipher, and the alternative key, if one exists, has not been found. The decoded text of the Zen 408 was confirmed accurate by law enforcement analysts independently of the hardened solution, and the cipher itself was thereafter treated in the case record as solved, meaning the 390-character body of the text was considered definitively decoded, while the 18-character terminal block was noted as an open item. In the context of the broader investigation, the decoded text provided confirmation of statements the writer had made in the accompanying letters, but no information about identity, location, or the specific circumstances of any act. The cipher confirmed what the letters already described. It introduced no new facts. The motive statement, the afterlife belief, the collection of slaves, the enjoyment of the act, these were consistent with what the accompanying correspondence had already established, and the decoded cipher added precision and documentation to that established record without expanding it. The physical cipher, as originally mailed, existed as 3 separate documents, one sent to each newspaper. Each section was a partial grid of handwritten symbols on paper, the characters pressed into the page in the block printing style consistent with the other confirmed Zodiac letters. The newspapers held their respective sections, and copies were provided to law enforcement. The confirmed solution, when it was established, was produced from the assembled grid, the 3 sections placed together in the order that produced the complete 408-character sequence. That assembly was itself a step in the solution process, since the individual sections were not individually solvable without the others, and the order in which they were combined was not specified in the accompanying letters, requiring the solvers to determine correct ordering as part of the process of working through the cipher. Donald and Betty Hardin's approach to that ordering was documented in their submission to the San Francisco Chronicle. They had tried multiple arrangements of the 3 sections and confirmed the correct ordering by the internal consistency of the text, The arrangement produced. A given ordering was correct if it produced coherent English throughout the decoded body, and incorrect if it produced incoherence. The confirmed arrangement, once established, held for the full 390-character decoded text, and researchers reviewing the solution have found it consistent with the confirmed letter-to-symbol assignments in the hardened solution across the full body of the decoded text. The Ciphers symbol set, as assembled across the full 408-character grid, included characters from several different visual systems. Some were recognizable to any reader familiar with the standard English alphabet, capital letters used in their standard orientation, or used in reversed form. Some were recognizable to anyone with exposure to Greek letters or to astrological notation from any source. Others had no analog in any standard system and appeared to have been drawn specifically for use in this cipher, their forms idiosyncratic and not repeated in any other documented cipher from the same case. The total count of distinct characters in the symbol set was 54. A standard 26-letter English alphabet, with each letter assigned one symbol, would require 26 symbols. The Z408's 54 symbol set meant that on average each English letter was assigned approximately 2 symbols. Though the distribution was not uniform, the most frequent letters in English, which most needed to be obscured to defeat frequency analysis, were assigned the greatest number of symbols, while less common letters were assigned fewer. The construction of a homophonic substitution cipher of this kind requires that the cipher maker have some understanding of English letter frequency in order to know which letters to assign the most symbols to. Whether that understanding was precise and informed by formal knowledge of cryptographic method, or approximate and based on intuition or general familiarity with how English words look on a page, is not established in the case record. What is established is that the cipher functioned, that frequency analysis alone was insufficient to break it, and that the Hardens required crib-based reasoning to gain their first confirmed symbol assignments before the rest of the solution could proceed. After the solution was confirmed and reported by the San Francisco Chronicle, further expert analysis was applied to the cipher by both law enforcement cryptanalysts and independent researchers. The hardened solution held under that review. No alternative solution has been proposed and accepted for the 390-character body of the decoded text. The final 18 characters have been examined repeatedly, with no confirmed result. The various analyses applied to those characters over the decades since 1969 have not produced a reading that has met the standard of confirmation applied to the hardened solution for the main body of the text. The case record holds the Z408 in its current status as a solved cipher with a single unresolved component, 18 terminal characters of unknown content, documented and open exactly as they have been since the cipher was first published and then decoded in the summer of 1969. The solved text itself is preserved in the case documentation as the decoded output of the confirmed hardened solution, its misspellings and idiosyncratic phrasings intact, the plain text sitting in the record beside the symbol grid that produced it. The two documents, cipher and decoded text, together constitute the Z408 as it exists in the confirmed case record, a partially solved cryptogram whose solved portion provided documentation of stated motive and whose unsolved portion has carried an open question forward through more than 5 decades. The physical letters on which the cipher symbols were written were treated from early in the investigation as forensic evidence. Law enforcement agencies received the newspaper-submitted sections in the form of copies and originals, depending on the specific circumstances of each submission, and the original documents were preserved and examined. The block printing style of the cipher characters was noted as consistent with the block printing style of the accompanying letters, which was consistent with the block printing in subsequent confirmed communications from the same writer. The symbol forms themselves were noted for consistency, particular symbols drawn in particular ways, with characteristic pen strokes and proportions that appeared repeatedly across the grid in a manner consistent with a single author pressing the same character repeatedly onto paper over the course of a single writing session. The 3 newspaper offices to which the Z408 was mailed received their sections at roughly the same time, consistent with simultaneous mailing. The Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner each held their sections separately. Each contacted law enforcement after receiving their respective letters, and each published the cipher after editorial consideration of the demand and the accompanying threat. The near simultaneous arrival at 3 separate offices, each holding one part of a complete document, was itself noted by investigators as evidence of planning. The cipher had been constructed as a whole, divided into 3 portions, addressed to 3 separate recipients, and mailed in a manner calculated to ensure all 3 sections appeared in print within a short enough period that readers and solvers could assemble them into the complete grid. The construction and distribution plan had been designed before any envelope was sealed. The kitchen in Salinas where the Hardens worked is not a location in the case record in any formal investigative sense. It is a location in the record of how the cipher was solved, the place where a specific methodological approach based on reasonable assumptions about what the text would contain was applied patiently over the course of a week until the grid of 54 symbol characters had yielded 390 characters of English plaintext. The Hardens were private citizens who had read the cipher in the newspaper, recognized it as a solvable problem, and applied themselves to solving it. Their solution was submitted in writing, reviewed, confirmed, and entered into the case record as the accepted solution. The Z408 was solved by 2 people working at home with pencils and paper and a newspaper, using systematic reasoning rather than any specialized equipment or formal institutional access. That is a documented fact about how the cipher was broken, and it is also a fact about the cipher's construction. A homophonic substitution cipher built from a 54-symbol set applied to a 408-character plaintext was the level of cryptographic complexity the Z408 represented. It was enough complexity to require systematic effort and careful reasoning. It was not enough complexity to prevent a solution from being produced within approximately 1 week by 2 people working from correct assumptions about probable content. The cipher resisted casual reading. It could not simply be looked at and understood by anyone who picked up the newspaper. It required the specific methodological step of crib-based symbol assignment, worked forward from a reasonable starting assumption to yield its text. And once that step was identified and applied correctly, the text emerged. Researchers who have examined the Z408 in retrospect have noted that the cipher's construction, while functional and effective against naive frequency analysis, would have been vulnerable to any solver who correctly identified the cipher type and then applied appropriate crib-based methods. The Z408's length, 408 characters, was sufficient to produce meaningful statistical patterns once the crib-based approach had established a foothold. Each confirmed symbol assignment added to the known portion of the substitution alphabet, and each addition allowed new portions of the text to be tested and either confirmed or revised. The solution built on itself once the first correct assignments were made, and the Hardens' initial assumptions about I and kill proved accurate enough to open the cipher. The 18 undecoded terminal characters did not open. They have remained in the same state, present at the end of the grid, visible in reproductions of the original document, examined by investigators and researchers across 5 decades as a short unresolved row that sits after the last confirmed character of the decoded text. If they encode a name, it is a name that has not been read from them. If they are padding or deliberate obstruction, that determination has not been formally confirmed either. They exist in the record as an unresolved item in an otherwise solved cipher, documented with the same precision as the rest of the grid, and carrying the same open question forward that they carried when the Hardens submitted their solution in the first week of August, 1969. What the solved Z408 contributed to the case record was a confirmed version of stated motive in the writer's own encoded words, documentation that went beyond the accompanying letters because it had been deliberately constructed to require effort to read and had then been read anyway. The decoded text did not identify the writer. It did not provide location information or details of specific acts beyond what was already present in the unencoded letters. It provided, in decoded form, a statement of why the writer claimed to do what he did, and a description of what he believed would follow from it. Those statements were consistent across the Z408 and the accompanying correspondence, internally coherent with each other, and documented in the confirmed case record. The cipher grid, as published across 3 newspapers in late July and early August 1969, is a specific physical object, 408 characters arranged in rows, the symbols pressed into the paper in block printing, divided across 3 sections, and sent to 3 separate offices and then assembled for the first time by readers, and eventually by the Hardens, into the complete sequence. That complete sequence, once assembled, was read. Most of it yielded to a solution produced by 2 people with pencils at a kitchen table in Salinas. The final 18 characters of it did not yield and have not yielded in the 5 decades since. They remain at the end of the grid in exactly the form in which they were written, a short row of symbols, documented, open, and still without a confirmed reading. The record holds the cipher in its current state, 390 characters decoded, confirmed, authenticated, entered into the case documentation, with the plaintext beside the symbol grid, and 18 characters sitting at the end of that grid after the last coherent sentence of the decoded text has ended, carrying whatever they carry, a name, a mistake, an intentional obstruction, or simply the last mark of a pen that stopped at 408, without resolution, without a confirmed reading, without an answer that has been established to the same standard as the one the Hardens produced in the summer of 1969, when the cipher was new and the question of whether it could be solved at all had not yet been answered. That question was answered. The broader question attached to those final 18 symbols remains where it has always been, in the case record, in the original document, in the short unresolved row at the end of an otherwise solved grid, sitting quietly in the file that holds it, as open as it was on the morning. The Hardens set down their pencils and sealed their solution in an envelope addressed to the San Francisco Chronicle. On the 11th of November, 1969, a sheet of paper arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle's offices. It had been mailed 3 days earlier, on the 8th, and its contents were a grid of symbols, 340 of them, arranged in 17 columns and 20 rows, the characters sitting in their even lines in the Zodiac's block printing, each one placed with the same consistent pressure the newspaper had come to recognize from the correspondence it had been receiving since July. A short taunting note accompanied the grid. The note was brief. The grid was not. The cipher that arrived that November was denser than the one the Chronicle had published 4 months earlier. Where the earlier cryptogram had used a 54-symbol character set, this one drew on an expanded set, supplemented with additional characters not found in the previous cipher, some familiar, some appearing in the Zodiac's correspondence for the first time. The grid itself was taller and narrower than its predecessor, its columns close together, its rows running evenly down the page. To look at it was to see something that appeared organized, internally consistent, deliberately constructed. The symbols did not look like noise. They looked like a message waiting for a key. The Chronicle published it, as it had published the earlier cipher. Investigators, cryptanalysts, and interested members of the public attempted it. The American Cryptogram Association examined it. The FBI's Cryptanalytic Division, which had worked on the earlier cipher and reviewed its confirmed solution, turned its attention to the new grid. What followed was not a quick resolution. What followed was a span of time that extended past the active years of the investigation, past the cold periods and the periodic re-examinations, past the development of new computational tools and new statistical methods, past the retirements and deaths of the original investigators. The Z340 sat in the case file. It sat there for 50 years. The difficulty was not simply one of symbol frequency. The earlier cipher, the one the newspapers had published in 3 parts in July 1969, had been a homophonic substitution cipher, a method in which the most common letters of the English alphabet are assigned multiple interchangeable symbols, specifically so that no single symbol appears with the frequency one would expect from a standard substitution. Frequency analysis, the classical tool of code breaking, depended on the fact that in English the letter E appears far more often than any other, followed by T, then A, and so on. A homophonic substitution cipher deliberately obscured that pattern by giving E, T, and A each several different symbols that could be swapped in at random. The result was a character frequency distribution that looked far more even than ordinary English text ought to look, and which therefore resisted the standard attack that solvers would apply first. That method alone had made the earlier cipher harder than a simple substitution. What made the Z340 resistant for 50 years was that it incorporated a second layer beneath the substitution, a transposition, a rearrangement of the symbols in a specific pattern before they were written down in the grid. Correctly identifying the homophonic alphabet was not enough. Even with the right substitution key in hand, the resulting text was not legible English because the symbols had been rearranged before encryption was complete. The transposition had to be identified and reversed before the substitution could yield anything readable. And identifying the specific transposition pattern from the outside, without knowing in advance what the plain text ought to look like, was a problem that resisted both manual and computational approaches for decades. The investigators who worked the case in its active years knew the cipher was layered. They knew it was more complex than the first one. What they did not have was a method that could efficiently enumerate and test the number of possible transposition patterns against a statistical model of English text at a speed that made the problem tractable. The cipher sat. The case file accumulated other documents, other letters, other pieces of evidence. The Z340 remained in its grid, 340 symbols in 17 columns and 20 rows, a known quantity that was also an unknown one. David Orenchak had been studying the Zodiac ciphers for years before December 2020. An American web designer by profession, he had maintained a long-term research interest in the case and had built and maintained online resources dedicated to the cipher analysis. He had spent years examining the Z340, testing approaches, documenting what did not work and what the failure modes were, and understanding the structure of the problem well enough to articulate why standard attacks were failing. What he had, in addition to his own analytical work, was an understanding of the specific kind of computational assistance the problem required. Not brute force, but a statistical scoring method that could evaluate candidate decryptions faster than any manual approach could. Sam Blake was an Australian mathematician. Jarl van Eyck was a Belgian software developer who had built a cipher-solving program called AZ Decrypt. The three worked together across different time zones, their collaboration conducted at a distance, each contributing something the others could not supply alone. Van Eyck's software used a hill-climbing algorithm, a method that began with a candidate solution, evaluated it against a statistical model of how frequently letter combinations appear in English text, and then made small adjustments to the substitution alphabet and transposition parameters, keeping changes that improved the score and discarding those that did not, iterating upward toward a solution the way water finds the top of a hill by always moving toward lower ground. The algorithm cycled through thousands of candidate alphabets. Each one was scored. Most of them produced noise. The software continued. The question of the transposition path was where Blake's mathematical work became essential. The Zook 340 grid could be read in many ways. Row by row, left to right, top to bottom, was the most obvious, and it was the reading that had been tried first and had not yielded a solution. But the grid could also be traversed diagonally, or in alternating directions, or in patterns that skipped rows or columns, according to a regular rule. The number of possible reading paths through a 17 by 20 grid was not small. It was a number that made exhaustive manual testing impossible, and that made even computational testing challenging, without a way to prioritize candidates. Blake's contribution was to work through the mathematics of possible transposition routes, identifying constraints that allowed the search space to be reduced from an impossibly large number to a set that AZ Decrypt could meaningfully evaluate. The reduction was what made the problem tractable. The reading path they identified, the one that finally worked, zigzagged diagonally through the grid rather than proceeding row by row. Tracing that path through the 340 symbols rearranged them into an order from which a homophonic substitution cipher could be extracted and read. When the transposition was reversed and the substitution applied, the text that emerged was not noise. It was English. It was misspelled, idiosyncratic English of the kind that appeared in the Zodiac's other confirmed correspondence, the same irregular spacing, the same particular errors, and it cohered into legible sentences. The team submitted their confirmed solution to the FBI on December 5th, 2020, 51 years after the cipher had arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle in its envelope with its short, taunting note. The decrypted text opened with a line that read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me." That sentence had been sitting in the grid since November 1969, and what it communicated, from the distance of 51 years, was the same voice that had been present in the other confirmed correspondence, the same register of address directed at investigators and the public, the same quality of confident, deliberate communication. The text continued, "I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me." The afterlife framework, the belief or claimed belief that the people the Zodiac killed would serve him in a life beyond this one, appeared in the Z340 plaintext, just as it had appeared in the earlier solved cipher. The same logic restated, the same language of accumulation and ownership. The misspelling of paradise as paradise matched the earlier cipher's misspellings, a consistency researchers noted as characteristic of the confirmed Zodiac correspondence across multiple documents. What the decrypted Z340 did not contain was a name. It did not contain new identifying information. It did not contain a location, a description, a detail about the crimes beyond what had already been established from other correspondence and investigation. The cipher that had resisted 51 years of analysis, that had required an international three-person team and purpose-built software, and Blake's mathematical reduction of the transposition problem, opened to reveal a message that was, in terms of investigative value, consistent with what the Zodiac's other communications had provided. A statement of position, a taunt directed at the investigation, a reaffirmation of the afterlife claim. The cipher had been complex. The message inside it had not advanced the case in the way that a name or a location might have advanced it. Orenchak's team documented their method in detail. The process of identifying the transposition layer, reducing the search space, and applying AZ-Decreep's scoring algorithm was laid out systematically enough that other researchers could follow the steps, verify the solution, and understand exactly where the previous 50 years of attempts had fallen short. The cipher had not been resistant because it was impenetrable. It had been resistant because the combination of its transposition layer and its homophonic substitution created a problem that required both the right mathematical framework for the transposition and computational scoring fast enough to evaluate the resulting substitution candidates at scale. When those two components were available at the same time, in the hands of people who could bring them together, the cipher yielded. The FBI confirmed the solution. The confirmation was the result of the same kind of careful cross-reference that had confirmed the earlier cipher's solution in 1969, comparing the decrypted text against the statistical and stylistic characteristics of the known Zodiac correspondence, verifying that the solution was consistent with what was already established about the cipher's construction, and ruling out the possibility that the team had found a spurious but grammatically plausible reading that was not the intended plaintext. The confirmation was reported publicly. Orenchak, Blake, and Van Eyck had solved what had been for half a century one of the most studied unsolved ciphers in American criminal history. The Z340's grid had been published in newspapers, examined by professional cryptanalysts, entered into databases, run through early computational approaches as they became available, and studied by an international community of amateur and professional researchers across the full span of those 51 years. None of the earlier attempts had been unintelligent. Several had come close in the sense of correctly identifying that a transposition was likely involved. What they had lacked was the specific combination of Van Eyck's scoring algorithm, Blake's reduction of the transposition search space, and the computational speed that made running the full evaluation feasible. The problem had not been waiting for a smarter solver. It had been waiting for a particular set of tools to exist in the same place at the same time, available to a team with the knowledge and persistence to use them correctly. The long interval between the cipher's arrival at the Chronicle and its solution means that the people who originally handled it, the investigators who worked the case in its active years, the cryptanalysts who first examined the grid, the editors who published it, did not live to see the decryption confirmed. The investigation itself, as an active operational matter, had moved through periods of high activity and long quiet before the 2020 solution. The case was never formally closed. The Z340 was always part of an open file, always available for re-examination when new methods or new researchers turned their attention to it. That the solution arrived in 2020 rather than in 1975 or 1990 or 2005, was a function of when the right tools became available, not of when the right effort was applied. There is a particular quality to reading a confirmed solution for a cipher that was constructed in 1969 and opened in 2020. The text of the Z340 plaintext is not a new document. It was written at the same time as the other confirmed Zodiac correspondence, by the same hand in the same period. What changed in December 2020 was not the message but the ability to read it. The symbols had always encoded those particular sentences. The diagonal transposition path had always been the one that, when followed, rearranged the characters correctly. The substitution alphabet had always been the one that mapped those rearranged symbols to the letters of the English words the Zodiac had written. All of that had been true since November 1969. For 51 years, it was simply a truth that was present in the grid and unavailable to anyone reading it. The confirmed plaintext was examined by researchers who had spent years on the cipher problem. Some had published analyses of what the Z340 might contain based on partial statistical work. Some had proposed specific transposition methods that turned out to be close to the correct one. The confirmed solutions settled questions that had accumulated over decades of study and introduced for those researchers a particular kind of satisfaction that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation, the experience of watching something that had been hypothesized, approximated, and approached from multiple directions, finally come to rest in a verifiable form. What the solution also did was narrow the field of unresolved Zodiac ciphers from 3 to 2. Before December 2020, the Z340, the Z13, and the Z32 were all unsolved. After the confirmation, the Z340 joined the Z408 as a solved cipher, its plaintext documented and verified. The Z13 and Z32 remained open. They had been open since 1969 and 1970 respectively, and the solution of the Z340 did not provide new cryptographic keys that could be transferred to the shorter ciphers, because the shorter ciphers presented a different kind of problem, one in which brevity, rather than structural complexity, was the primary obstacle. The Z340 had been hard because of what it was. The remaining two were hard because of how little of them there was. The FBI statement confirming the Z340 solution noted the solution's verification and acknowledged the team's work. It did not announce a breakthrough in the broader investigation. The decrypted text, as stated plainly in the confirmation, contained no new information about the killer's identity. The cipher had carried a message, and the message had been read, and the message said what the other correspondents had said: a taunt, a restatement of the afterlife claim, a voice addressing the investigation from a position of assumed distance. The Z340 had been sealed in its grid for 51 years, and when it opened, it confirmed what was already known and answered no question that had not already been answered by the Z408 in the confirmed letters. There is something worth attending to in the specific texture of that outcome. The Z340 was the most complex cipher the Zodiac produced. It required the most sophisticated analytical approach of any document in the case to decrypt. The combination of transposition and homophonic substitution made it resistant to every tool available for 50 years. And when a team with the right tools finally read it, it said the same things. The voice in the grid was the same voice as in the letters. The claims were the same claims. The afterlife logic was restated without elaboration. The cipher had been locked tightly, and inside the lock was a familiar room. Researchers who had worked on the Z340 for years before the 2020 solution received the confirmed plaintext in different ways. Some noted the consistency with the other correspondence as confirmation that the cipher was authentic and the solution correct. Some noted that the absence of new identifying information was itself information, that the cipher may have been designed not to communicate new facts, but to demonstrate that the Zodiac could construct and send something that investigators and the public could not read. The construction and the sending in this reading were the message. The complexity was the content. What was locked in the grid mattered less than the fact that something had been locked there that could not be opened. That interpretation is not confirmed. It is a reasonable reading of a documented outcome, held at the distance appropriate to something that cannot be established from the record alone. What the record establishes is that the cipher was constructed with considerable technical skill, that it was sent, that it was not solved for 51 years, and that when it was solved, it contained no new investigative information. Whatever the intent behind its construction, those are the documented facts of what it produced. The confirmed solution is held in the case documentation alongside the Z340 grid itself, which remains part of the physical evidence in the open case file. The grid and its plaintext now sit together as a solved document, as the Z408 has sat with its own confirmed solution since 1969. The difference is the interval. The Z408 was solved in days. The Z340 was solved across a span of 5 decades by people who were not all alive at the beginning of that span, and by methods that did not exist at the beginning of it. The case file holds both timelines now, the short and the long, as documented history. The Z340's diagonal transposition path, the one Oranchek's team identified, is a specific geometric fact about a 17 by 20 grid. Following it means reading not the first row from left to right, and then the second row, but moving diagonally through the columns in a pattern that produces, across all 340 characters, an ordering that the homophonic substitution alphabet can then convert to readable text. The path had always been there in the geometry of the grid. The grid had always been a particular arrangement of 340 characters that, when traversed in that specific way and decoded with that specific key, produced those specific sentences. None of that changed between 1969 and 2020. What changed was the presence of people with the tools to find it. Van Eyck's AZ Decrypt software continues to be used by cipher researchers. The Z13 and Z32 have been run through it, as they have been run through every analytical method that has become available since their arrival. The results for those two ciphers have not produced a confirmed solution, and the reason is one the software itself cannot overcome. There is simply not enough text. AZ Decrypt's hill-climbing algorithm scores candidate alphabets against statistical patterns in English. Statistical patterns require length to emerge. At 340 characters, the Z340 provided enough material for the algorithm to score candidates meaningfully. At 13 characters and 32 characters, the shorter ciphers do not. The Z340, in the period after its confirmed solution, became in some ways a demonstration of what patient, methodical, technically sophisticated work could produce against a problem that had resisted for decades. The same team, with the same tools, could not replicate that outcome on the shorter ciphers, and the reason was structural rather than intellectual. The problem had a different shape. The solution to the Z340 did not generalize across the remaining unsolved ciphers, and the case file remains open, the Z13 and Z32 sitting in their documented unresolved state, exactly as they have since the late 1960s. What the November 1969 envelope contained, the one with its 17 by 20 grid and its short taunting note, was a document that the Chronicle received and published, and that investigators and researchers would examine for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. The sheet of paper with its 340 symbols was filed. The investigation continued in its way, active and then quiet, and then active again. The cipher became one of the most studied in the history of American cryptographic analysis. The original document, the paper the Zodiac handled and addressed and mailed from somewhere in November 1969, was preserved as evidence, held in the case file, along with the other physical correspondence. The solution confirmed in December 2020 was submitted to the FBI 51 years and 24 days after the Chronicle received the cipher in the mail. The three people who submitted it, Oranchak, Blake, and Van Eyck, had worked across different countries using software. One of them had built, and mathematical analysis, another had produced, and research into the specific failure modes of previous attempts that the third had accumulated over many years of sustained attention. The collaboration was conducted remotely, across time zones, without any institutional support or official mandate. They solved it because they had the right tools and the knowledge to use them, and because the problem, for all its 50-year resistance, was a problem that could be solved. The plain text sits in the record now, confirmed and documented, beside the grid that encoded it. The first sentence, the hope that investigators were having fun trying to catch the sender, had waited inside the diagonal transposition since 1969. The slave collecting claim, the paradox misspelling, the voice that matched the other correspondence, all of it had been present in the symbols since the grid was assembled and sealed. The confirmation changed nothing about the message. It changed only the ability to read it, and reading it returned the same unanswered question the cipher had always carried. The message was there, and the sender was not. The case file containing the Z340, in its original form and in its confirmed decrypted form, is maintained as part of an open investigation. The long interval between construction and solution has become part of the cipher's documented history, not a story of failure, but a record of when a particular combination of tools and people became available to a problem that required them. The solution is confirmed. The cipher is solved. The grid of 340 symbols, the one that arrived at the Chronicle on November 11th, 1969, has been read. What it said, when the diagonal path was traced and the substitution applied and the text was laid out in the clear, was a familiar voice in a familiar register, taunting and certain, and offering nothing new, the same presence that had been in the correspondence from the beginning, still unreachable, still enclosed in the distance between a written document and the person who wrote it, the distance across which Oranchak, Blake, and Van Eyck worked between California, Australia, and Belgium, across a problem that had accumulated 5 decades of failed attempts, collapsed in December 2020 into a confirmed solution delivered to the FBI in a document that the case file now holds alongside the original grid. The 2 pages, the cipher and its plaintext, are part of the same evidence record. They have not changed the open status of the case. They have not produced a name. What they have produced is a solved cipher, one that resisted longer than any investigator working the case in 1969 would have expected, and that, when it finally opened, offered the same settled, unanswerable quiet that runs through all the confirmed Zodiac correspondence, the record of something that was sent and received and held and read at last, with no one on the other end of it to answer for. On a sheet of plain paper mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle On April 20th, 1970, below a handwritten phrase that read, "My name is Iyer," there was a single row of 13 symbols. That was all. 13 characters set down in the same block printing that appeared across the confirmed correspondence, the symbols drawn with the same even pen pressure that investigators had documented across the letters that preceded this one. The line was brief enough to take in at a single glance, and what it claimed to contain, the actual name of the person who had written it, had not been confirmed in the more than 5 decades that followed its arrival at the newspaper's offices. The Zeph 13, as investigators and researchers came to designate it, represented in one sense the most direct statement the Zodiac had made across his entire documented correspondence. The letters and ciphers that had arrived before it had described a motive, had claimed victim counts, had threatened a school bus, had enclosed physical evidence authenticated against a named murder victim. This one line claimed to go further than all of those. It claimed to answer the question that every investigator working the case, every cryptanalyst who had examined the symbol sets, every researcher who had spent time with the documents had been working toward: 13 characters. The assertion that they held a name, and then below them the crossed circle symbol, consistent, present, drawn in ballpoint ink exactly as it had been drawn on every confirmed communication before it. The challenge the Z-13 presented was not the same kind of challenge as the one the Z-340 had presented. The Z-340 had resisted solution for over 50 years, in part because of the specific technical layering of its construction, a transposition placed beneath a homophonic substitution, requiring a solver to identify not only the symbol-to-letter assignments, but the correct path through a complex grid, before any of those assignments would resolve into readable text. The Z-13 presented a different problem, and in some ways a simpler one to describe, though no easier to solve. 13 characters provided almost no statistical material to work with. Frequency analysis, the foundational technique of classical cryptanalysis, required patterns across a long body of text to identify which symbols appeared most often, and to map those appearances onto the known distribution of letters in English. 13 characters did not produce that kind of pattern. Hill-climbing algorithms, the same computational methods that had ultimately contributed to the solution of the Z-340, required a large enough sample that candidate alphabets could be scored against each other in a meaningful way, a way in which the correct solution would produce a consistently higher score than incorrect ones. In a cipher of 13 characters, the scores converged. Multiple candidate solutions produced similar scores, and there was no reliable method for determining which, if any of them, was correct. The FBI's Cryptanalytic Division had examined the Z-13 during the active investigation period and had been unable to produce a confirmed solution. That finding was noted and held in the case record. The American Cryptogram Association, whose members included experienced amateur and professional cryptanalysts, subsequently examined the cipher and arrived at the same result. When the AZ Decrypt software developed by Jarl van Eyck, the tool that had contributed materially to the 2020 solution of the Z-340, was applied to the Z-13, it produced multiple candidate outputs, none of which scored decisively higher than the others, and none of which could be confirmed against any independent evidence. The shortness of the cipher was not a technical failure on the part of the investigators or analysts who examined it. It was a documented property of the cipher itself, and it meant that the question the Z-13 claimed to answer remained, across every subsequent examination, unanswered. Whether the symbols encoded an actual name, the killer's name, placed deliberately in a row below a written claim that they did exactly that, was a question investigators approached with careful attention to what the record showed and what it did not. The cipher claimed to be a name. That claim was documented. Whether the claim was accurate, whether the symbols below it decoded to the word or words the writer asserted they held, was a separate matter, and one that the evidence available had not resolved. The possibility that the Z13 was a deliberate misdirection, a cipher placed below a tantalizing written claim, precisely because the solver who cracked it would find either nothing coherent or a name that was false, was noted by researchers. It was not confirmed. Neither was the possibility that it held a real name. Both possibilities remained open in the record, as they had since the letter arrived in April 1970, and what could be said with documented certainty was that the 13 symbols sat on the page exactly as they had always sat, unresolved, the written claim above them unchanged by the passage of time. The Z32 arrived in a different context entirely, enclosed within the same physical object as one of the most carefully documented pieces of evidence in the entire case record. On December 20th, 1969, the Zodiac mailed a letter to Melvin Belli, a prominent San Francisco defense attorney, addressing him by first name in a passage that researchers and investigators noted was tonally different from the great majority of the confirmed correspondence. The letter enclosed a swatch of fabric that subsequent analysis confirmed was cut from the shirt Paul Stein had been wearing at the time of his murder, authenticated physical evidence, a documented object, an object the sender possessed because of a specific event in the case record. On the back of the greeting card included with that letter, a block of 32 symbols was arranged in a roughly rectangular grouping. That was the Z32. The symbol set the Z32 employed was not identical to the symbol sets that appeared in the other confirmed ciphers. It shared some characters with the Z408 and the Z340, the two ciphers that had been solved by the time researchers began giving the shorter ciphers sustained attention. It also contained characters found nowhere else in the confirmed correspondence, unique glyphs, apparently introduced specifically for this cipher, whose inclusion meant that the substitution alphabet from either of the solved ciphers could not simply be applied to the Z13 and expected to yield results. The 32 characters were arranged carefully on the back of the card in a format consistent with the Zodiac's established practice of presenting cipher material in a grid or near-grid layout, the symbols written with the same block printing style that characterized all confirmed communications. 32 characters, like 13, presented the same fundamental problem for cryptanalysis. The statistical threshold below which frequency analysis and hill climbing methods became unreliable was not a fixed number, but the researchers who applied these methods to the Z32 found that the cipher sat comfortably below it. The expanded symbol set, including the unique characters found nowhere else, introduced additional uncertainty, since those characters could not be assigned preliminary values based on their appearances in the longer solved ciphers. The FBI's examination of the Z32 during the active investigation period produced no confirmed solution. The American Cryptogram Association's subsequent examination produced no confirmed solution. The application of AZ-Decrypt to the Z32 produced candidate outputs, as it had with the Z13, that could not be differentiated on statistical grounds alone. Multiple possibilities, scoring similarly, with no external evidence available to confirm any single one. The Z32 had been in the case record for a long time before it received the concentrated computational attention that later decades brought. During the active investigation period, Resources were directed primarily at the Z340, the longer unsolved cipher, and at the physical evidence associated with the crimes themselves. The Z32 was examined, documented, and held in the record, its 32 symbols photographed and archived alongside the rest of the correspondence. When the Z340 was solved in December 2020, the question of whether the same team or the same methods could now address the shorter ciphers was a natural one. David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck had spent years developing the approach that ultimately cracked the Z340, and the tools they had refined, particularly the AZ Decrypt software, which Van Eyck had built and continued to develop, were subsequently applied to the Z32. The result was the same result the FBI and the American Cryptogram Association had produced before them: no confirmed solution. The brevity of the cipher and the additional complexity introduced by its unique symbol characters held the same limit against more sophisticated methods that it had held against earlier ones. What the Z32 held, if it held anything coherent, was a question that remained open in the way the record documented such things. Not dramatically, not as a wound in the investigation, but as a factual condition of the evidence. The cipher was there. It had been examined. It had not yielded. The physical document containing it, the greeting card mailed to Melvin Belly, was maintained with the rest of the confirmed Zodiac correspondence in evidence storage, the symbols on its back face exactly as the writer had placed them in December 1969. Both the Z13 and the Z32 occupied a particular position in the documented history of this correspondence. The two longer ciphers, the Z408 and the Z340, had been solved, their plaintext confirmed, their methods understood and described in published analysis. The two shorter ciphers had not been solved, and the reason they had not been solved was not that investigators had failed to find the right approach. The reason was structural, and 13 characters and 32 characters were, by the documented assessment of every expert and organization that examined them, insufficient in length to allow the available methods to function reliably. The ciphers sat at the edge of what cryptanalysis could address, and they had sat there since their arrival, and they continued to sit there as of the most recent public reporting on the case. This was a condition of the evidence, as documented and as plain as any other finding in the record. The original physical documents, all of the confirmed Zodiac correspondence, including the letters and cards that contained the Z13 and the Z32, were maintained by the San Francisco Police Department and by the relevant county law enforcement offices as evidence in an open case. An open case was what the Zodiac investigation formally remained, as of the most recent available public record. No arrest had been made. No perpetrator had been charged. The case file persisted in the same condition it had occupied for decades: a documented record of crimes committed, of correspondence sent and received, of ciphers partially solved and partially not, of forensic examinations conducted and reconducted and scheduled for further review as technology advanced. The advances in forensic DNA technology that had transformed cold case investigation across the country in the years since the Zodiac crimes had prompted periodic requests for re-examination of the physical documents. The letters and cards and envelopes that constituted the confirmed correspondence were physical objects, paper and ink sealed with saliva, handled by the sender, transported through the postal system, and handled again by the recipients who opened them. Physical objects of that kind, maintained carefully in controlled storage, were candidates for the kind of forensic review that had resolved cases far older than this one, and the Zodiac investigation had been no exception to the interest those methods attracted. The results of any forensic examination of the physical correspondence that produced material conclusions would constitute case evidence and would be held and reported accordingly. What the most recent public reporting confirmed was that the documents remained in evidence storage, physically intact, and that the case remained open. There was something worth observing, quietly and without emphasis, about the Z13 in particular. Not a conclusion, not a theory, but a documented feature of the record. The letter it arrived in had been mailed in April 1970, nearly a year after the first ciphers were published in the Bay Area newspapers in July and August 1969. By April 1970, the Z408 had been solved by Donald and Betty Hardin. The San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald had all published and re-examined the Zodiac's communications. The case was widely covered. The letters were widely known. The writer, whoever had composed and sent them, had been following the press coverage closely. This was documented across the confirmed correspondence itself, in postscripts that acknowledged news articles and referenced specific reporting. When the Z13 arrived in April 1970, below the written claim, "My name is," the writer was aware that his ciphers had been solved before, and that solvers would attempt to decode this one. The cipher's brevity, its 13 characters, was not an accidental feature. Whether it was brief because a name was short, or brief because a cipher of that length could not reliably be solved by the methods then available, was not established by the record. Both explanations remained as possibilities. Neither had been confirmed. The same observation applied to the Z13. 32 characters was a longer cipher than 13, but it remained below the threshold at which the available methods produced reliable results. And the additional unique characters it contained introduced complications that a solver working only with the established Zodiac symbol sets could not overcome. Whether the Z32 was constructed at that length because the content it encoded was naturally that brief, or because a cipher of that length was resistant to decryption in a way the writer understood, was a question the record did not answer. Investigators and researchers had noted both possibilities. Neither had been confirmed. Both remained in the record as the kinds of open questions a documented investigation carried without resolution, the kind that did not close when the case did not close. The last confirmed Zodiac letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, postmarked January 29, 1974. It did not contain a cipher. It was a short letter, block printed in the same hand as the confirmed correspondence that had preceded it across the previous 5 years, signed with the crossed circle symbol that had appeared on the first confirmed communications in August 1969. The letter referenced the film The Exorcist and made a brief, somewhat oblique comment about it. It was identified and confirmed by investigators as authentic Zodiac correspondence based on the handwriting characteristics, the symbol, and the physical properties of the document. After that letter, no further confirmed communications arrived. The correspondence, which had run from July 1969 to January 1974, a period of approximately 4.5 years, stopped. The crossed circle symbol on that final letter was the same mark that had appeared on the earliest confirmed letters, a circle divided by a cross, drawn in ballpoint ink on plain paper, consistent across the full documented span of the correspondence. It had appeared at the beginning when the first 3 letters were mailed to 3 different Bay Area newspapers, on or around the same July day in 1969. It had appeared across the letters that followed. The letters with postscripts, the kill count claims, the bomb threat, the letter to Melvin Belly, with its enclosed swatch of authenticated physical evidence. It had appeared in 1971 and 1972 and 1973 as the letters became less frequent, and it appeared on the last confirmed letter in January 1974. The same mark, drawn the same way, present from the first document to the last. What the symbol meant to the person who drew it was not established by the record. That it was placed deliberately and consistently was documented across every confirmed letter in the case file. The interval between the last confirmed letter in January 1974 and the present day was long. It was a factual interval, a documented span of calendar time across which the investigation continued without producing an arrest. The case file accumulated without producing a conclusion, and the ciphers that remained unsolved, the Z13 and the Z32, continued to be examined and to resist examination in the way their brevity dictated they would. That interval was not a gap in the record, it was part of the record. Cold cases persisted across long intervals. The documented history of the investigation was a history of that persistence, of the file remaining open, of forensic methods advancing and being applied to the physical evidence, of researchers working on the ciphers with better tools each decade than they had possessed the decade before. The Z340 had been solved in December 2020, 51 years after it was mailed. That fact sat in the case record as a documented development, unambiguous in what it established, that the timeline on which questions like these were addressed could extend far beyond the period in which the original events occurred, and that tools and methods unavailable in 1969 or 1989 or 2009 had become available by 2020, and that the record was open to whatever subsequent developments brought. What the Z340 solution had not produced was a name or any new identifying information about the person who had written and sent the confirmed correspondence. The decrypted text had confirmed the same voice, the same claims about an afterlife and the accumulation of slaves, the same idiosyncratic misspellings that appeared across the Z408 in the confirmed letters. It had offered, in other words, more of what the record already contained, and it had not moved the case toward an arrest or a formal identification. The same was true in a different register of the Z13 and the Z32. Their unsolved status was not what prevented investigators from identifying the Zodiac. The identification question was and remained a separate investigation, depending on forensic evidence, physical evidence, and documentary evidence of kinds that the ciphers themselves did not supply. Whether those 13 symbols held a real name was, in the end, a question about the cipher. Whether that name, if it was real, would have established the killer's identity was a different question, and one the case record did not allow a definitive answer to. What the record held was this: approximately 20 confirmed letters and communications sent over a period of approximately 4.5 years to 3 Bay Area newspapers and to named individuals in San Francisco. 4 ciphers designated the Z408, the Z340, the Z13, and the Z32. 2 of those ciphers solved, the Z408 in August 1969 by Donald and Betty Hardin at a kitchen table in Salinas, California, and the Z340 in December 2020 by David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck, working across 3 countries. 2 of those ciphers unsolved, the Z13 and the Z32, both examined by the FBI, by the American Cryptogram Association, and by computational methods including AZ Decrypt, and both found to be too brief, for the available analytical tools to produce a reliable, confirmed solution. A case still open in the files of the San Francisco Police Department and the relevant county law enforcement offices. Physical documents maintained in evidence, storage, intact, available for re-examination as forensic technology continued to develop. A crossed circle symbol on the last confirmed letter, drawn in ballpoint ink on plain paper in January 1974, the same mark as on the first. There was a quality to the record of this case that was different from the quality of cases whose documentation was incomplete or scattered. The Zodiac correspondence existed as a substantial, carefully authenticated archive. Letters examined and re-examined, ciphers analyzed by multiple independent experts across multiple decades, physical documents held in controlled storage and available for the forensic methods that advanced years and decades after they were first collected. The record was not thin, it was extensive, and in some respects it was unusually well preserved for a case of its age. What the record did not contain was a conclusion, an arrest, a name formally and legally established. The two solved ciphers had not supplied those things, and the two unsolved ciphers, in their brevity and their resistance, had not supplied them either. The Z13 sat in the case file as it always had, 13 symbols below a written claim. The writing around those symbols had been examined, the envelope and paper analyzed, the physical properties of the document documented. The symbols themselves had been tested against every available method and returned no confirmed solution. They continued to represent what they had represented since April 1970, a cipher of unknown content, accompanying a claim of unknown accuracy, on a document whose author was known only by the name he had given himself in August 1969. The Z13 sat in the same place, in a different folder, on the back of a greeting card that had traveled through the mail in December 1969 and arrived at the office of a named attorney in San Francisco. The card had been handled and examined and photographed and archived. The 32 symbols on its back were recorded in the case materials with the same precision as every other element of the documented correspondence. They had been examined. They had not yielded. They had not been confirmed as encoding anything, and they had not been confirmed as encoding nothing. They remained in the record at the level of documented uncertainty, examined and open, a 32-character question held in a file that had been holding questions since before most of the people who subsequently worked on it were born. The researchers who had developed AZ-Decrypt, the software that contributed to the 2020 solution of the Z340, had applied it to both shorter ciphers and documented the results. The results were published and available to other researchers. Other researchers had applied their own methods and documented their results in turn. The body of analysis surrounding the Z13 and the Z32 was itself now a substantial record, a record of attempts, methods, candidate solutions, and the reasons those candidates could not be confirmed. That secondary record was part of what the case had accumulated across 5 decades, along with the primary documents and the forensic findings and the investigative materials held in the open case file. The San Francisco Police Department maintained the case as open. That was a documented administrative fact, as plain as any other. Open cases persisted in the system that held such things. Their files updated as new analyses were conducted, or new forensic requests were filed, or new relevant information came into the record. The Zodiac case had accumulated across 5 decades, the kind of documented history that very few open cases accumulated, extensive, varied, involving investigators and researchers and cryptanalysts and forensic scientists across a span of time that stretched from the late 1960s to the present. The file was thicker than most, the record was longer, the questions were older, and the questions were, as far as the confirmed evidence allowed the record to establish, the same questions they had always been. There was one last detail that belonged with the Z13, not as a conclusion, but as a documented feature of the record that the file held without comment. When the Hardens solved the Z408 in August 1969, the final 18 symbols of that cipher, the last 18 characters of a 408-character cryptogram, did not decode to legible text.